You ever fly over Greenland and wonder, does anyone actually live down there? There's no question it looks stunning from the air, but the place barely seems habitable. Over 80% of the country is covered in a permanent ice sheet, yet 55,000 brave souls still choose to live there. It's remote, but a place of tremendous beauty, and it's also one of the only places you can find an Airbus A330-800neo outside of Kuwait, Uganda, and Toulouse. Say hello to Air Greenland, who operates bright red planes to a country who's named after the color green, but is actually mostly white. Now, unless you've been to Copenhagen, Reykjavik, or Greenland itself, I'll bet you've never seen an Air Greenland plane. But their story and evolution through the years is a very fascinating one, and very different than most. So let's turn back the clock to 1960 and see how the Soviets, of all people, may have been the reason Greenland has a national airline today. So back in the 1960s, as you guys may know, the Americans and Soviets had a bit of an arms race, and as more and more nukes piled up, both countries were increasingly on edge. To help detect preemptive strikes by the Soviets, the Americans had just constructed a series of radar stations from Alaska all the way to Greenland.
Our prime mission is the detection, the identification, and the reporting for all air-breathing vehicles within our operational area.
The US had an air base there, as well as some C-130s, but the harsh conditions at the die sites, notably Die 2 and Die 3, which were located on ice sheets 8,000 feet above sea level, made it highly impractical for the C-130 to make routine supply missions. So the Danish, who basically controlled Greenland at the time, stepped in to help us out. A fleet of more nimble, lighter aircraft were assembled, including Catalina seaplanes, Sikorsky S-55s, and DH-3 Otters, most of them leased from the Canadian government. Then in 1960, Scandinavian Airlines, yes, SAS, and a local mining company whose name I can't pronounce, teamed up to form Grønlandsfly, which later became Greenlandair and eventually Air Greenland in 2002. Now, Grønlandsfly did more than just keep US bases stocked. It revolutionized the transportation system in Greenland. Now, keep in mind that Greenland has no railways, virtually no roads, and no inland waterways. The main mode of transport to get both people and supplies from hubs to small towns and villages was either by boat or by dogsled. As such, airports with runways weren't really a thing, and they weren't going to get built overnight. So Grønlandsfly relied heavily on helicopters and seaplanes for its first couple decades in operations. It wasn't until 1979 until the runway in Greenland's capital city of Nuuk opened up. Now, it wasn't a very long runway, and it certainly couldn't accommodate any of the jet aircraft of the era, but it was a huge step forward for Grønlandsfly as it enabled them to launch international services to Canada, connecting Nuuk with Iqaluit. This route was served with the de Havilland -7 turboprop, known for its short takeoff and landing capabilities. Now, keep in mind that as early as the 1950s, Greenland did have international connectivity to Europe and North America, but only by necessity. SAS was the first to operate the so-called polar route between Los Angeles and Copenhagen, with refueling stops in Winnipeg and Kangerlussuaq. This fueled some international tourism to Greenland, but the country's infrastructure was still fairly limited, and the route became somewhat obsolete as faster, longer-range jetliners were introduced. So for most of the 70s and 80s, Grønlandsfly did not prioritize transatlantic services. Instead, they focused on expanding their domestic network as runways in Ilulissat, Narsarsuaq, and Kulusaq were built. -7s could operate between Nuuk, Kangerlussuaq, and those three cities, but helicopter transfers were still required beyond those districts. The Sikorsky S-61s remained the backbone of the helicopter fleet, but again, Grønlandsfly was using the helis for more than just passenger flights. They also operated charters to key mining sites such as the Black Angel zinc lead mine in Mamorlik, and they had a contract with the Danish government to conduct sea ice reconnaissance missions. Smaller rotorcraft were more suited to those jobs, so they added some Canadian-built Bell 206Bs to the fleet, which ended up operating until 2000. The 1980s was a huge decade for Grønlandsfly. First off, they had grown to the point where they were carrying more than 60,000 passengers per year, more than the entire population of Greenland. In addition, Greenland had just established its own home rule government, so the airline was able to gain more independence with less oversight from Danish government agencies. Said another way, the carrier now had way more control of its own destiny, and it used that freedom to expand into the hospitality business, taking over the Hotel Arctic in Ilulissat and offering travelers more than just a plane ticket, but also overnight accommodations. In 1986, Grønlandsfly finally decided to give SAS more competition on transatlantic services, partnering with Icelandair to connect Narsarsuaq with Copenhagen via Reykjavik. Those flights were on Icelandair metal, specifically the Boeing 727, and were only once weekly. but proved popular as the carrier could tap into demand between Greenland, Denmark, and Iceland. At the end of the 1980s, our little airline had grown up quite a bit. Grønlandsfly employed 400 Greenlanders, served over 20 destinations, and was carrying upwards of 100,000 passengers annually. In the 90s, the world's largest island continued to build out its domestic airport infrastructure, along with hotels and restaurants, making it easier for visitors to justify a visit to the country. Greenland's new tourism agency beefed up its marketing efforts, advertising the various tours, cruises, and hikes people could go on to see the icebergs, glaciers, fjords, northern lights, and more. And although Greenland didn't turn into Paris overnight, the country's efforts and investment in tourism did produce results. Between 1993 and 2000, the number of annual tourists increased more than sevenfold, most of them coming from Denmark. Grønlandsfly's growth mirrored this trend, as they launched non-stop service to Copenhagen with a leased 737 from Maersk Air, then acquired their own Atari Ferrari in 1998. Grønlandsfly's first jet airliner, the 757 was used to launch non-stop Kangerlussuaq to Copenhagen flights, competing directly with SAS for the first time, and it was a huge success. The 757 was a modern, fuel-efficient, and versatile aircraft, perfect for the harsh operating conditions of Greenland, and passengers loved it. As such, Grønlandsfly was able to capture a good amount of market share from SAS, and all told, by 1999, passenger counts had almost tripled to 282,000 annually. The 2000s marked a bit of an identity crisis for the carrier, as it struggled to balance the government's demands for expanding local Greenlander service while also keeping fares low, bringing in international tourists, and maintaining profitability. After several years of financial troubles, labor disputes, and the loss of a lucrative mail contract, the carrier needed a reset. Enter Air Greenland and the bold red livery we know and love today. The 2002 brand refresh marked a turning point for the airline, and they notched a couple key wins in 2003 when SAS abandoned its Copenhagen service, allowing the carrier to not only scoop up SAS's passengers on Kangerlussuaq to Copenhagen, but also take over a lucrative US Air Force contract, operating flights from Thule Air Force Base to Copenhagen. Now, given SAS was no longer in the passenger market, Air Greenland saw an opportunity to scale up capacity on Kangerlussuaq to Copenhagen, replacing the 757 with a second-hand A330 from Sabena, Belgium's national airline that went bankrupt in 2001. The tried-and-true Airbus widebody allowed Air Greenland to not only carry more passengers, but more freight. As you can imagine, there was a huge demand for inbound cargo space, as virtually nothing in Greenland is manufactured locally. There is little agricultural production other than fishing. Fresh vegetables and meat, flowers, and most consumer goods all had to be imported, some by sea, but more perishable items by air. Back then, even most dairy products had to be flown in, which might still be the case today. So you know that mail contract that Air Greenland lost in 2002? Well, in 2006 they got it back by taking over the airline that stole it from them, Air Alpha Greenland. It was a small acquisition, but very strategically important, as it gave the carrier a virtual monopoly of all air charter operations on the island. With Air Alpha came 4 helicopters that Air Greenland also used to fulfill passenger demand between smaller cities like these two I'm going to put on the screen that I'm not even going to try to pronounce.
Itokormit? Itokortomin.
Now, if you're following where we are history-wise, you would know that the global economy was sort of booming in the 2006 to 2008 timeframe. Air Greenland was riding the wave just like everyone else, and in early 2007, they launched service to the US, deploying their 757 once weekly between Baltimore and Kangerlussuaq. Why they chose Baltimore is a little unclear to me, but I'm assuming it mostly came down to costs, with landing slots at BWI being a lot cheaper than JFK or Newark. At any rate, it was a big deal for the airline, and the route launched to much fanfare, but it unfortunately didn't last long. Just a few months in, a bunch of American tourists got stranded in Greenland as a result of an Air Greenland strike, and the company refused to make alternate arrangements for their return. Additionally, many Americans just weren't sold on Greenland yet as a tourist destination, so the route lost a bunch of money and was axed in 2008. When the recession hit, Air Greenland wasn't hit as hard as some of its European counterparts, but it did curtail some services, including the Narsarsuaq to Copenhagen route. In the 2010s, Icelandair went on the offensive in Greenland, opening routes to Nuuk, Narsarsuaq, and Ilulissat from Reykjavik. Air Greenland responded in kind by launching Nuuk-Reykjavik flights with their newly acquired Dash 8 turboprops. Through the rest of the decade, Greenland's tourism industry grew substantially, But it was a bit of a double-edged sword for Air Greenland. More tourists meant higher costs associated with delays, cancellations, and irregular operations. And Air Greenland didn't have the luxury of rebooking passengers in a later flight. There was only one A330, and if it had mechanical issues, or the crazy Arctic weather did what crazy Arctic weather does, it had no option but to put tourists up in hotels. Nonetheless, load factors remained strong. And by 2019, aka pre-COVID, profits had reached a record 89 million krona, and passenger numbers eclipsed 430,000 annually. That same year, SAS and the Danish government, who still collectively owned a majority of the airline, sold their shares to Nuuk, meaning that the Greenlandic government now had 100% control of Air Greenland. With less cooks in the kitchen, Air Greenland could make decisions quicker. And one of their first was to level up their digital experience for customers, rolling out a mobile app and a new loyalty program called Club Timisa. Then they turned their attention to the fleet, specifically the aging A330 that at this point was 22 years old and had accumulated over 50,000 hours of flight time. The 787-8 and A330-800neo were both considered, but management eventually decided on the A330 due to its superior takeoff performance, offering a nearly 400-meter advantage compared to the Dreamliner. The MOU was signed in January 2020, and at the time seemed like an excellent way to celebrate Air Greenland's 60th anniversary. However, we all know what happened next. The pandemic hit and air travel basically ground to a halt. Air Greenland, of course, saw passenger ticket sales collapse, but they actually remained profitable in 2020. This is probably due to two reasons. First, they were able to downsize quickly, reducing schedules and laying off about 15% of their staff. And second, they were able to keep their A330 very busy, ferrying medical personnel and supplies between Greenland and Denmark. Many of their domestic routes were deemed essential, and the government, of course, helped fund the transport of medical equipment and test kits throughout the country. So they emerged relatively unscathed. But pandemic or not, they were going to need external financing to pay for their new flagship plane, as well as other fleet renewal ambitions. 2022 was a banner year for the airline in terms of passenger numbers, but profitability tanked as the airline faced a number of operational challenges, poor weather, staff shortages, and technical issues. So Air Greenland couldn't have been happier when Tukak rolled off the line in Toulouse.
In Greenlandic, we actually have one word, that means we finally got our new big aircraft. And that one word is
Now, make no mistake, Greenland will always be a niche destination, and Air Greenland will never be a world-class airline in terms of passenger amenities and comfort. But for a country of their size, a plane this new and this big certainly made headlines.
It is big. It is really big that such a small company in such a large country with so few people is actually able to make this important investment for the future.
And I think it will leave a great impression on international visitors, hopefully enabling the country to expand its tourism industry and create more economic opportunities for the Greenlandic people. So yeah, that's the story of Air Greenland. A company that Greenland probably can't live without, but a company you may have never heard of. Unfortunately, I don't have any first-hand footage yet to share with you guys, but it's certainly on the bucket list. If anyone has any Greenland travel stories, definitely share them below in the comments. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this historical review of Air Greenland, and I wish you the safest and happiest of travels wherever your journeys may take you. So long from Flaps HQ here in Orlando.